down. And our next speaker is part of our project, as I hope many others of you will also, and we have some others in the background too. All right, Elvira Morell is a doctoral student in the Department of Spanish and Portuguese here at Vanderbilt. Her main field of study is Afro-Hispanic literature and culture, and she's way too modest in her own presentation here. Her research interests encompass Latina studies, race, religion, visual arts, music, and gender. Her dissertation explores how various 20th and 21st century Cuban and Cuban diaspora artists and writers have presented the Abakuá society, a Cuban religious and male confraternity, and how the society's colonial legacies have shaped modern and contemporary cultural practices. That's what Elvira wrote to me, but I just wanted to add that she is now holding multiple fellowships at the Humanities Center and the library. She's working with SSDA regularly as well. She's an artist and musician and published author herself. So I add a little bit to her modest.
Thank you all for being here, and thank you, Jane, for the coda to my introduction, my presentation. So I'm going to present Anarquistas y Cuatreros, the deportation of Abakuá society members to Fernando. Cuban demography basically descends from two transatlantic geographical enclaves, the Iberian Peninsula and the African continent. The settlement of Spaniards began in Cuba in the 16th century. During the second half of the 18th century, the entry of African slaves to the island increased, although the traffic dates to the second half of the 16th century. The plantation system catalyzed the massive supply of labor essential for sugar production, leaving behind practices of protection and humanization of slaves. It was necessary to constantly replace the dying slave, which led to the increased importation of labor to sustain the business. As a result, the enslaved African became another gear in the sugar production process. This image by La Plante, Ingenio El Narciso, it's an idyllic representation of the sugar mill. The testimony by Juan Francisco Manzano, for example, the enslaved poet, depicts the Ingenio, the sugar mill, as an arid and dry place. As you can see, these palm trees, all the green in the landscape, suggest more the Garden of Eden. Between 1790 and 1865, the importing of slaves in Cuba amounted to 600,000 in total. The 1841 population census shows the following statistics. You can see in my slide. 498,000 enslaved, 162,000 free people of color, and 440,000 whites, Comisión de Jefes y Oficiales. The sustained exportation of African slave labor caused a drastic increase in the black population on the island. Both the slaves' way of life and their religious practices were altered. The latter could point to the nullification of the original faith of the enslaved, but the opposite happened. The enslaved fused their religious practices, the African component and the Spanish Catholic faith. The public converts that never discarded their original beliefs communed with the Catholic Church, embraced baptism and Mass. They encoded the African deities into Christian icons, as happened, for example, with the Virgin of Santa Barbara, who was related to the warrior god Shango, based The enslaved and their descendants kept the ritual drums, ancestral garments. They practiced their group worship under the structure of the Cabildo de Nación, nation groups, and the confraternities, both congregations in the style of African brotherhoods permitted by the colonial government. The economic social relations generated in Cuba during the colonial period favored the appearance of fraternal groups and or brotherhoods of various kinds. The Abakuá Society was one of these groups, recognized and as an expression of a different discourse. This gave way to their desires, needs, and aspirations of otherness without abandoning their core beliefs. As a result, they developed hybrid practices that contributed to an expression of a national identity, a uniquely Afro-Cuban one. The first evidence of the existence of the Abakuá Society dates from 1834 to 1836, when the enslaved of the Aballi nation, coming from the Equipe society, Leopard, grouped under the name of Abakuá and founded the first Potencia, Abakuá group, known as Efibuton or Efiquebuton for their Creole descendants in the town of Regla. The Abakuá Society, an esoteric brotherhood of magical religious phenotypes, was created as a group for mutual help and protection, in which funds are also gathered and allocated to assist the brothers. In addition, it fostered free membership and it was a secret organization. An informant from Lidia Cabrera's research expressed his dissatisfaction with the researchers' emphasis on the secret aspect of the society above other attributes, although he recognizes the rights and the private space. In a nutshell, non-members of the society cannot understand legends, symbols, and other aspects. Tato Quiñones maintained that many years ago the organization abandoned its secrecy. The members of the Potencias, popularly known as ñañigos for the little devil or Ireme, also known as ñaña or ñañigo, must love and serve each other as brothers and keep the most absolute reserve regarding the cult of Eque and the hermetic rites of the brotherhood. This is the first commitment they make when they begin the initiation process. From its inception, the society was established as an association for men. Almost all the members survived for my thesis agree that the society has a strict precepts regarding manhood, and Abakuá must be a good friend, a good husband, and a good father. Take care of the mother and their children, and above all, be loyal to your ecobios, brothers of faith. Fraternity is the fundamental precept of the Abakuá. The political power of the Abakuá was not overlooked in colonial times. Like Freemasonry, the fraternal character of the society conditioned the mentality of the Spanish authorities on the island. As a fraternal organization, it immediately fell into the same category as Masons, known as conspiradores, conspirators, and anarquistas, anarchists. Despite the existence of white potencias, the Abakuá society was composed mainly of Afro-Cubans. Therefore, in addition to the two qualifiers mentioned above, conspirators and anarchists, they fell into the category of Afro-Cuban thieves. Since its foundation, the society embraced marginality and popular consciousness was marked by the idea of the Abakuá as someone who behaved improperly and was on the periphery and subsequently was stereotyped as an outlaw. According to Lidia Cabrera, quote, "For many years, the Potencias Ñáñigas were a refuge for criminals and for the people in the last days of the colony. Ñáñigo became a synonym for thug." In 1875, Spain inaugurated the political prison of Fernando Po. In my dissertation's third chapter, I analyzed the work Memorias de un Deportado, 1903, Memoirs by a Deported, by Manuel Miranda, a unique testimony about a Cuban Abakuá deported to the prison of Fernando Po. In this text, I examined the Abakuá presence and explored the nature of the deportations of Abakuá members from Havana and Matanzas cities to the prison in the African island, today Bioko Island. I have found 6 first-hand testimonies by deportees to Fernando Po between 1858 and 1899. The first one, Los confinados a Fernando Po, impresiones de un viaje a Guinea. The confined to Fernando Po, impressions from a trip to Guinea by Balmaceda, Francisco Balmaceda, and published in New York in 1860. A second edition was printed in Havana in 1899. The second one, Revolución Cubana, Deportación a Fernando Po, relación que hace uno de los deportados. Cuban Revolution, Deportation to Fernando Po, a narrative written by one of the deportees. A text attributed to Miguel Bravo Sentíes, published 9 years later in New York. He was on the ship San Francisco de Borja, which was the same as Balmaceda. Number 3, Los Deportados a Fernando Po in 1869, memoria escrita por Juan B. Saluet, una de las víctimas. The extradition of the deportees to Fernando Po in 1869, a memoir of one of the victims, Juan B. Saluet, published in Havana in 1892. And I have 3 more. You can see all the titles there, and I won't read it all. But the most important is Memorias de un Deportado, Memoirs by a Deportee, by Manuel María de Miranda, was published in 1903, but he's writing his own experiences as deportee, and that's the only text that mentions the Abakuá. Fernando Po was under Portugal jurisdiction for almost 3 centuries. In 1777, Portugal gave Fernando Po to Spain. There are 2 versions of this transaction. The first one refers to the exchange of Fernando Po for Trinidad on the Brazilian coast. And the second version, the one I prefer, states that the Spanish crown received the African island under a secret treaty signed in Madrid on March 24, 1778. Under Carlos III's reign in Spain and José II in Portugal. In 1827, England took possession of Fernando Po under the command of Captain Owen on October 27. England abandoned the island 6 years later, in 1833, after the legal claims of Spain. England alleged the unhealthy conditions of the island, and those were the motives for leaving. After Spain recovered the island, the colony was in absolute neglect until the arrival of Don Miguel de Sanz in 1856. He was there with a Catholic mission with 40 individuals. That is the first time for the arrival of a Catholic mission. Before 1856, only Protestant missions were there. The official faith of Fernando Po was Catholic, but there was freedom to choose other denominations or even non-denominational cults. Most of the African population in Fernando Po was Protestant. By Orden Real, royal order, on June 14, 1836, only deportees convicted for 8 or more years were allowed to be taken to Fernando Po. On August 27, 1841, the authorities decided to send only political convicts, but the deportation of Ñaños never ceased. They were considered as dangerous as the revolutionaries. The Abakuá deportation to the island began on the middle of the 19th century. Hundreds of Abakuá were taken on numerous trips from Havana until 1899. These testimonies are the evidence of the significance in a political and ideological ground of the deportations to Fernando Po. According to Isabella de Arasandi, quote, the deportation of Ñaños to Africa was in part due to their association with rebel groups in the decades and years prior to and during the War of Independence, so that their image is presented with negative characteristics that led to their isolation by the colonial society. The Spanish government sent a sizable number of Cubans to Fernando Po. This fact was also documented in the diary of the British subject John Holt, published in 1948. Holt describes the deportees as poor wretches in search of lodging and food during the early days of their stay on the island. Holt also states the disproportionate difference between the two groups. Quote, there was no more than 100 Spaniards to 150 or 250 Cubans. End of quote. The Abakuá deportations were more numerous in the 1890s, but still there was a substantial number of Afro-Cubans in the first wave. Most of them were in prison just for having tattoos on their bodies. There are 4 big deportations waves. The first one, 1866, later 1869, 1881, and 1896, which were documented without many details. We know from the press that the first deportation of 1866, at the time of the governor of Cuba, Francisco de Lersundi y Ormachea, many Ñañigos were sent to Fernando Po. The official records of deportations don't provide many details. On the other hand, the press selectively points out how many Ñañigos were on the list of deportees. After the first arrest of the Potencia in 1888, the sacred objects from the Ñañigos altars were sent to the Museo de Ultramar, Overseas Museum, and were displayed in an exhibition. This was the triumphal entrance of the Ñañigos into the cultural panorama of Spain. According to the articles that I have found in my research, we can access to the following data. And you can see the chart there on the slide. 150 ñañigos, con estos son 230 los individuos de esa asociación deportados a nuestras posesiones de África. The total amount of 230 includes those in Fernando Po and the newer arrivals. 181 ñáñigos y varios políticos muy conocidos en la isla. 181 ñáñigos, and that was in La Iberia, 1896. El País, 1897, 97 ñáñigos, 20 political prisoners. La Época, 1897, 31 deportados, de estos 13 ñáñigos, 31 deportees, among them 13 ñáñigos. And el Movimiento Católico, 1897, chief note stated, 24 confinados, 24 confined, 69 ñaños and rustlers. I have already transcribed and collated all the documents related to the Abakuá deportations from the Matanzas archive in Cuba, and I have been working since 2018 at the Slave Society's Digital Archive in the History Department, where I found in 2019 the first documents related to the Abakuá deportations in Matanzas, Cuba. I was transcribing the volume Religiones Africanas, African Religions, from the Archivo Provincial, and found a series of deportations between 1844 and 1899, in which the deportees were accused of being members of the society and labeled as rustlers and anarchists. There are some examples of the language used in those documents from Matanzas. These are some examples. Ñáñigos y de malos antecedentes. Ñáñigos and bad reputations. De malos antecedentes y miembros de la ilícita sociedad de ñáñigos y ser todos en extremo, en mismo grado, todos perjudiciales a la sociedad en la que vivimos. Bad reputations and members of the illicit society and all those who are extremely harmful to the same degree to the society in which we live. Forgive my wordiness, but this passage was written in police reports in the ethos and mindset of an 18th century xenophobic colonizer. Not all individuals were deported to Fernando. Some of the ñaños, remain in the political prison of the Isla de Pinos in Cuba. And because the Abakuá were considered dangerous by colonial Spanish authorities, they were not pardoned in 1898. However, the pardon that benefited other political deportees didn't apply to the ñaños, Cuatreros, y Anarquistas. Abakuá Society affiliates rustlers and anarchists. They were absolved after the independence of Cuba, 1 year later. Historical evidence collated by Asandi suggests the deportation of 1,500 ñaños in the second half of the 19th century. Due to its small state character, the society, the Abakuá Society, and its members were considered a threat almost impossible to control. Their political power, the regularity of their meetings, and the prevailing brotherhood were an absolutely disturbing factor of unity for the colonial authorities. Additionally, racial prejudices and social stigma. So the first members of the Abakuá Society were Afro-Cubans, descendants of the enslaved Africans. They didn't belong to a privileged class. The complex Cuba economic mechanism that gave birth to the convoluted social stratification was the variable that segregated the enslaved and their descendants from the predominantly white upper class. The enslaved sons inherited the macula and social displacement as their parents did, according to the colonial tradition. The violence against the enslaved and their descendants was inherent to the slavery system. At the end of the 19th century, the Abakuá were represented as Cuatreros and Anarquistas. Thank you.